Let's see if we can help you. Let's see if we can find out what
Greetings
was
from historic
started.
Eatonville, Florida. On behalf of the Association to Preserve the Eatonville Community, I am N.Y. Nathiri, welcoming you to this webcast. I want to thank Dr. Julian Chambliss, Dr. Philip Cunningham, and Professor Trent Domingo for their participation. I want to acknowledge Professor Maria Ferguson and the Full Sail University team, Mike Olaski and Jason Capobianco. Thanks also to Ria Posey and Dr. Clarissa West White. This looks to be a very exciting webinar. Thank you for participating. Let's get started.
I want to thank everybody who registered for this webinar. Thank you for registering. I think that it's going to be a pretty lively webinar. My name is Trent Domingo. I am a professor of humanities at Seminole State College in Sanford, Florida. And I have with me two very distinguished guests, and that's Dr. Julian Chambliss from MSU and Dr. Philip Cunningham from Wake Forest University. And so we are going to be having a conversation, a moderated conversation between the three of us. And we're going to open it up for questions and answers from the audience later on. So the only people you hear talking right now is going to be the three of us. And when we open it up for Q&A, the questions that are being fed to me, I will get to as many as I can that will, be for the panelists. And when you send in the question, if you want to ask it of a specific panelist, either one of these gentlemen, we ask that you, put their name in there for that. If you're going to ask a question, we ask that you don't put it in the chat. You put it in the Q&A section, so that way we can get to it directly. Okay, so we really do appreciate that. I'm going to allow or let Dr. Chambliss and Dr. Cunningham give brief descriptions of themselves. Once we start the conversation, they both have a lot of honors and accolades, and I can't remember all of them. So I'm going to just let them, sort of toot their own horn, so to speak. But I at least wanted to let you know, who's talking to you. So this webinar is called Welcome to Afrofuturism, a Guide Amidst Tumultuous Times. And I'm going to ask Julian if he will just introduce himself, tell a little bit about his title and his background.
Sure. My name is Julian Chambliss. I'm professor of English at Michigan State University. I'm also the Val Berriman Curator of History at the MSU Museum. And I'm a part of the Consortium for Critical Diversity in the Digital Age Research, or CEDAR, at MSU, and the co-chair or co-director of the Digital Humanities Literary Cognition Lab here at MSU. I'm actually from Florida. I grew up in Florida, in Jacksonville. And for many years, I was professor in the Department of History at Rollins College in Central Florida. So my work is primarily focused on African-American spaces and places. I often say I study the real and imagined city. My degrees are in history, and I'm very interested in sort of Black speculative past as it connects to the transformation of African-American experience really since the 19th century.
Okay, thank you. And Philip?
Hi, I'm Philip Lamar Cunningham. I am assistant professor of media studies at Wake Forest University. Primarily, I study Black popular culture writ large and in general, but my primary areas of research involve comic books, popular music, television and film. I'm in several anthologies and several journals, primarily based again on comic books and studies of superheroes. And so I'm very glad to be here.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. I want to start this conversation off with the obvious question, and I want each of you to answer it the best way you can. For lay people, what is Afrofuturism? Julian?
So Afrofuturism is defined as sort of Black imagination and creativity related to visioning a better world, right? There are a number of different definitions associated with Afrofuturism. And the original definition, I teach a class on Afrofuturism. The original definition is coined in 1994 by a cultural theorist named Mark Derry. And it has to do with African American themes, science fiction that deals with African American themes and signification of a prosthetically enhanced future might be called, for lack of a better term, Afrofuturism. But that definition is really sort of rooted to a very particular cultural moment, 1994, the end of the Cold War and the emergence of globalism. And in fact, there's a broader practice of Black speculative work that challenges the status quo that we as scholars associate with Afrofuturism. So you can also think of Afrofuturism as dealing with the subject position of Black people in the modern world, right? It's a Black people's way of dealing with the struggle or the problem of modernity. So it's Black imagination in the service of a better kind of society.
And I don't know if I can really expand on that much more than just to sort of suggest that, you know, part of it also involves thinking about what a Black utopia looks like in some cases. It's also thinking forward about what Black liberation and freedom would look like, particularly within moments in which those things were not taken for granted. And, you know, if not outright, just not options, you know, so we're talking about, 1859, you know, when the sort of first Black futuristic text appears, people are still enslaved. And so projecting forward about what freedom would look like, I think also is a way of thinking about Afrofuturism. Otherwise, I would just pair it with Julian had to say.
Okay, and that actually segues perfectly into my next question. Is this then within the sort of realm of sort of magical realism or wishful thinking for the people at the time? Or is there a political element attached to it to where it involved actual action at the time?
Well, I think that there's always an element here of political action, right? Like one of the lines that I often repeat is that when Black people imagine in the public sphere, it's political because their imagination by default becomes a challenge to the status quo, right? Because as a subject people who are struggling towards freedom, their vision for a future that is free by a natural process has to call into question the practices that create the world as it is because it is unfree, right? So there's always a sort of political component there, and I tend to make a kind of distinction between a kind of magical realism, which doesn't necessarily always have a future-oriented element to it, whereas I think of Afrofuturism as always having a future element to it. That there is a utopian, I use the utopian term here in the broad sense, like a utopian element to an Afrofuturist text, which that doesn't necessarily have to be the case with a sort of magical realism text. in my, my reading.
Okay.
And if you want to think about this as like maybe a call, maybe it's not necessarily always a call to action, right? But I think just the idea of, these texts and what they do, which is sort of, I think of, texts like Roger Sherman Tracy's The White Man's Burden, which we sort of have in the exhibit as well, which sort of, again, is satirical. It's taking sort of these preconceived notions and flipping them on their head, right? Which in itself is an act of revolution, especially in 1915, right? So in and of itself, right, it's not necessarily this call to action, unless you read them literally, right? So, you think about some of these texts that are suggesting like actual slave revolts or actual upending of governments and like in the narrative. They're not necessarily suggesting that you should, but I'm not necessarily wholly convinced that people would be opposed to that. But I think in and of themselves, again, given their times in which they're being published, I mean, they're nothing short of radical acts to me.
Mm-hmm. And so, for someone like me who teaches humanities, I'm always mining what writers and artists have produced at a certain time period to show people what was in sort of, Black intellectual thought at the time. And I think that still is very key because of the dearth of information that we get, at least in Florida public schools. I would venture to say nationwide, but I can only speak for Florida. That it's just not there. And so they don't understand that there were a lot of Black people who had different ideas, and not everyone was thinking the same thing. And so for every Frederick Douglass, we have what was the gentleman's name? It escapes me right now. But for every Booker T, we have a W.E.B. Du Bois. For every Elaine Locke, we have a W.E.B. Du Bois. And so when you get to these kind of ideas, it lets people see just how vast Black intellectualism was. And I think that that's something that's very valuable, especially since we're talking about the idea of going against what people normally think, and that being a sort of a component of Afrofuturism.
Right. And I think you can see that in all of the things that we looked at. And again, Julian and I, in our exhibit, sort of only, scratch the surface in many regards. But I mean, just thinking about the different texts that we looked at, there's no one approach to sort of how this gets done, right? There are people who are proposing cooperation, right? There are people who are proposing revolution. There are people sort of saying that, a future with Black people involved in it is not necessarily possible. Then there are some people who are saying that it is. So you're right. There's myriads of threads, right? From people we would consider today as very liberal, and to somebody like George Schuller, who's very conservative, even for today, arguably. So you're right. What you see here is a tapestry of Black ideologies, and the sort of reification of the notion that there's 8 million ways to be Black, right? So I think you see that there too.
Yeah, and I think that's an important part of the exhibit, in the sense that, in choosing these works, one of the goals is to remind people that for African Americans thinking about the future, no path is left unturned, right? Like there is nothing that people will not consider as they're thinking about projecting themselves into a better future. And while Afrofuturism as a sort of contemporary movement seems very particular, right? It seems like something very, very modern. In many ways, it is part of a long set of practices by people of African descent who are experiencing modernity in the Western world, right? And those are all really carefully chosen words. It's about people of African descent, and in particular, this exhibit is my own personal African Americanness, right? So I'm really trying to consider this in the context of like how African American speculative practice sort of intersected with the broader political transformations happening in the United States. And again, because the exhibit was in the context of the festival sort of investigation of Afrofuturism, there's an assumption here that there are a number of these are a number of texts that most people of color have not seen, like most Black people are not familiar with. And even in these texts, the struggle of African Americans is a global one, right? Like that is one of the recurring themes, even in these works. Despite the many perspectives that are involved, there is a global um, set of ideas that freeing Black people is, in the American context, is connected to like a global sort of freedom, which is really interesting.
Right, and I think that's really important. And since we keep referencing the exhibit, I think this would be a good time to sort of let everyone know what exhibit we're talking about. This is an exhibit that is at the Zora Neale Hurston National Museum of Fine Arts in Eatonville, Florida. So if you are close to this area, or even if you're not close, you can travel to the historic Black town of Eatonville. It is the oldest incorporated African-American municipality in the United States, and you can see this exhibit. And these two gentlemen have created a wonderful example of what they call Black speculative imagination. And I want them to expound on that because it sounds too academic. But you need to go and see it because I was there just sort of, milling about and doing some offhand things for the museum. And I was able to read each of the panels. And as well read as I am, there are several of the people that I had not heard of or I knew in a very cursory way. And so if you really want to understand the depth of what these men are talking about, go and see the exhibit that they put together. And that is at the Zora Neale Hurston National Museum of Fine Arts in Eatonville. And it is called The Transformative Legacy of the Black Speculative Imagination. The Transformative Legacy of the Black Speculative Imagination. You will be thoroughly pleased by what you see in the exhibit. And so, and now I want to kind of ask that question to both of you. How do you define then Black speculative imagination? Julian?
Well, the first part of the exhibit is the past unremembered. Like the first part of the title.
That's right, the past unremembered.
And that's a deliberate attempt on my part to talk about this idea that African Americans have relied on for freedom throughout their experience in the Western world. And so when I think about the Black speculative imagination, I think about those everyday practices by everyday African Americans to see past the contemporary moment, the moment they're in terms of like oppression, erasure, whatever negative terms you want to use, to project into the future. How do they make that decision? And sometimes that speculative imagination is highly theoretical. Like, let's rethink how we think about how society operates, which, at some level, anyone who was anti-slavery was rethinking how society was operating, right? Like, well, this system don't work. And sometimes it's deeply personal, right? What does it mean to think about my own personal worldview, my own space as a space of freedom? And so I think about the Black speculative imagination as the toolkit by which people of African descent vision their way past an oppressive structure.
And again, I can't really add too much to what Julian has really effectively said, other than to suggest that, again, I think everyone listening should keep in mind that we are focusing primarily on literature here, right? But in terms of, speculation, right? Predicting a future or envisioning a future, right? You hear that in the words of, or in the speeches of Frederick Douglass, right? Before anything's actually put down on paper, right? And I think we have to put these visions of put forth by these Black authors in conversation with, the speculation about Black futures being written by white people, right? So, there's we begin, or at least I know Julian framed the exhibit in light of, listen, the notion of the Black future or Afrofuturism is writ large in something like Black Panther, right, which is presented to us by Jack Kirby. And as much as we all love Jack Kirby, fact is he's a white guy, right? But you can even go back to the 1800s and look at, sort of a Black speculation of what is going to happen with Black people in the future from white people. And I think what we have to do is look at how there's a distinction between the two, right? So, for example, sort of abolitionists would often envision what the future looks like with free Black people, right? Often with some trepidation, right? There, you get people who sort of say, well, listen, if we let these people free, it's death, doom, destruction for us all. And then conversely, there's, people thinking about as early as 1831, what's the world going to look like if we ever have a Black president, right? You can see that in several newspapers at that time. So again, I think we have to think about that the real distinction being made here is that, we are projecting forward from a very, very specific lens, right? And that lens is specifically Black in this case.
Yeah, and I think that, again, in the context of this exhibit, we were sort of riffing off the sort of literary understanding that people have of Afrofuturism, right? Because, again, when we approached the exhibit, we approached it with the sense of what do people know? Not to say that people don't know anything, but they haven't been exposed to these ideas. And there's a real sort of deliberate pathway that if someone knows Afrofuturism and it's not a Black Panther, it's probably about Octavia Butler, which is great. Everyone loves Octavia Butler, but it's like a literary thing because they think of it as being primarily science fiction, like that original definition about science fiction. But just like Phil talked about, you can make an argument that there is a kind of Black speculative practice that is completely oral, right? Like it's singing, it's music, and oratory isn't really important for Black people visioning the future, acting on the future, right? Like word songs, like transmitting information about the environment, about freedom, about escape, like all these things. Like, so gospel music or music in general, like genres we do not associate with African American experience, transmit information, right? Like sound is information in the same way that like written text is information. And, when we talk about Afrofuturism, the sort of precepts around it as a genre that is associated with popular culture, because science fiction is in sort of the original sort of definition of it, we naturally think about it as being sort of like science fiction, right? But it's not necessarily that, right? It could be any number of epistemologies, right? It could be any kind of Black practice that thinks about knowledge production, right? Which is why that idea of the subject nature of Black people is so important, because like that terminology, that framework is something that a scholar named Alondra Nelson, who's really credited as like a key figure in developing Afrofuturism as a theoretical framework, puts forward. Like it's understanding the sort of subject position of Black people. It's understanding Black artistic products and projections as a kind of like reaction to and corresponding to modernity, right? And so, there's the reason that the exhibit is literary had a lot to do with like this a place that we understand a broad segment of society being rooted in, right? The symbolism is Black Panther because like, I have yet to run across a person who hasn't seen Black Panther, which is kind of incredible when you think about it, but it's true. So you've seen Black Panther? Like, yeah, I've seen it, right? So that visually is an important part of what you see. But the choice of texts really sort of speak to, yes, the science fiction genre that the speculative fiction genre that when you think about someone like Octavia Butler, when you think about more contemporary Black artists, Stephen Barnes, those people are also part of a lineage of African American writers and African writers really who are like Nettie Okorafor is African African American that are producing work, right? So part of our I think part of our goal with the exhibit is to try to create like a more holistic understanding of Black practice around visioning the future. In a short condensed way, right? Like it's an exhibit, so you're trying to do a lot in a little bit of space, and hopefully people will understand.
Well, as I said, I've seen the exhibit, and I think that it's a wonderful selection of different ideas. I was really amazed at how opposing some of the ideas were, to where when you look at the exhibit, you don't get the idea that there was like one umbrella kind of idea for Black people imagining a better life. When I read all of the different permutations of what freedom looked like from the different people, and freedom from what, I was amazed at how diametrically opposed some of them were. And so one in particular that I kind of want to ask you guys to sort of speak to is the idea of the I wrote it down right here. It is George Schuler's ideas. Mm-hmm. I know of George Schuler just from reading about the politics of the 60s and the 70s. But what I read in your panel description really gave me a much more broad understanding of him. So I kind of want to ask you guys to speak to this particular aspect of the idea of Afrofuturism, and that is the idea of a Black supremacy, a Black state that is just as dictatorial as what they consider the white state is, especially even at this present moment. So can you guys speak to that sense of trepidation in the minds of people that would make them write things like that? And I want to ask Philip to address this one first.
So I think one of the really interesting things about Schuler, of course, is that for those of you guys who don't really know a lot about Schuler, Schuler is pretty much sort of the preeminent sort of Black conservative of that era, right? The 1930s. He's writing for the Pittsburgh Courier. And, he's a bit of an iconoclast, right? His ideas are not readily accepted. I mean, he gets kicked out of his long-term career with the Courier for basically coming after Martin Luther King Jr., right? And so he's somebody who presents, and I think is wary of sort of this growing Black radicalism, right? You can sort of see it in sort of Black Empire, which is the piece that we highlight. But, he has other works, that are very similar, like Black No More, I think it's called, where, he's really interesting because in Black Empire, he's sort of questioning, as you rightly suggest, the notion of, well, what happens if you give Black people all this power, right? Will they sort of essentially put a blackface on all the ills that we've currently experienced, right? Will we usher in a wave of Black supremacy? But then you have Black No More, which sort of says, okay, well, if you change all Black people into white people, what will they do? And, you put that in the conversation with another text, right, which sort of sees a Black future in which Black people have power, right? Another piece we cover, which is The White Man's Burden by Roger Sherman Tracy. And he, in that piece, is looking at a distinct Black future. I think he's projecting into like the 51st century in which, Black people return to Africa, and they turn Africa into basically essentially a Wakanda, right? For a shorthand version. And in his vision, it's like, hey, well, listen, if we leave, if we pull ourselves from America, you guys are going to descend into barbarism. White America is going to completely fall apart. And then, in the novel, White America tries to reinvade Africa, much to their peril, right? So on the one hand, as you rightly suggest, right, you have competing visions from two Black men about what a black majority, black supreme society looks like, black supremacist society looks like, and they approach that from two very different points of view. I should note that both of them are writing a little bit satirical in some regards, but still, I think those competing visions say a lot about how they're thinking about the potential of black supremacy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the things about Black speculative work is that this sort of ideological range, and Schuler's Black No More is interesting in particular because in that story, a scientist invents a machine that allows Black people to turn white, and that does not necessarily herald the end of racial turmoil. What it does do, though, is it calls attention to how like people in power are exploitive, and that becomes quite clear. And so it's kind of like a structuralist critique in the midst of this satirical novel, and I think that when I talk to students about this idea of that there's a class element, a kind of critical engagement with the nature of how society operates is very important to, of course, to oppress people, right? Who knows more the ways the system can do you wrong than the person at the bottom? And in the context of speculative work, African Americans are not monolithic, and so as a Black conservative, Schuler corresponds, sometimes I can sort of see a through line between Schuler and someone like Zora Hurston, who later in her life becomes known as a kind of conservative voice, right? Comes out against the Brown decision, for instance. But the nature of that conservatism is rooted in a set of ideological frameworks that are set in opposition to a kind of societal narrative articulated by white people about the systematic nature of failure linked to Blackness. And so the conservatism that I see with Schuler is a conservatism that's really deeply suspicious of like any kind of absolutism related to race, right? And Schuler kind of doesn't like Du Bois. He really doesn't like this sort of sense of like a kind of intellectual, like an elite, right? And I think he would dislike an elite if it was because they're elite and because of the power question associated with like people who are elite, right? And I think that that's one of the things that continues to be a question for the African American community. And one of the lessons of this sort of Black speculative past, I want to think, is that despite these sort of different ideological positions, more often than not, these people were still on the same road. Like they were still moving forward as opposed to like scattered, right? Like they still like, well, I don't necessarily want to do it that way, but I do want to move forward. And like has the question of have we lost the certainty around the actual project of improving Black people's lives is one that you can start to ask yourself when you look at these works in totality.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, well, wow, you guys gave me a lot of, there's so many questions in my head, I don't even know where to start. I have some questions already prepared, but they're out the window right now. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. I want to go, since you mentioned Du Bois, I want to go to, I think almost everyone knows who W.B. Du Bois was, but not many people know about the comic. And so I want to address this idea that you guys write about in the panel on Du Bois's comic that explores the idea that if we were to remove societal pressures, a Black man and a white woman could actually have a relationship or fall in love. But see, the difference then would be that once the societal pressure comes back in, I haven't read it, but from what I understand from what you guys wrote about, the situation undoes itself, and then she reverts back to the original stance. So that's in the mind of W.E.B. Du Bois. That's coming out of W.E.B. Du Bois. What does that then say about his view of the hope for America? Philip?
I would argue that, what we're seeing with the comet are early threads of what we would say are Black pessimism, right? Which is the idea that, to some degree, I am not necessarily fully hopeful of, this future, right? I mean, because the comet is a post-apocalyptic, novel. Society has failed, right? And so the real question for Du Bois seems to be, okay, well, what happens, when society breaks down? Well, if you break down society, and we have no choice but to sort of lean upon each other, right? You have in this piece Jim and Julia. Jim's the black male. Julia's the wealthy white woman who's in the story. You strip them of all that pretense, and what happens? You have two people who can interact with each other. Once the norms of that original society are brought back into play, right? Julia drops my man Jim like a bad habit, and things go back to sort of normal, right? And so there's that thread of, hey, listen, it's racism that is easy to return if we sort of maintain this, structure, or if we go back to the structure. And then I think, you have to put that into play with the novel we focus on, which is his novel Dark Princess, which is also questioning racial hierarchies, right, in many ways, right? But in this one, it's a lot more concentrated on sort of, okay, what happens with the potential of I guess you could think of a Black global South, right? A world in which, now we can sort of come together. And, so it's really, he's doing some really, really interesting things at that time. But again, I would say, if anything, you see a degree of pessimism there, one that I think we ultimately see will play out in Du Bois' life later, because ultimately he gives up on the American project, right? He leaves. It's over for him.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I do think that one of the things about the Comet, which is a short story that you can read, like it's in Dark Water, which is a book that's freely available, like Project Gutenberg. Like if you want to go read it after you can like go and Google it and find it online. It is interesting because at some level, I always like point out to students, like, you read this story, it of the stories that we have in the collection, that we're referencing in the collection, it's probably the one that I think Philip has said this before, like it's the one that probably reads the most modern, right? Like it's a post-apocalyptic story, right? But I often like challenge students, like, what's the apocalypse here? Because if you're Black, all the white people dying ain't a bad thing, right? Like, just be honest. Like he wrote this in like 1931, 32. Like it ain't a bad thing if all the white people die. So right there, like you need to stop and like really ask yourself, like, what is he doing here? And then when you have this situation where there's a Black guy and a white woman, at points in that story, the implication is they're going to repopulate the earth. That is an Adam and Eve sort of situation. And you can see it in the thinking in the female character's head, how sort of coercive sort of racism has been, right? Because like with the fall of society and everything that made like Jim a very bad person, well, he seems very nice, right? Like, well, he's a man like any other. Like there are lines in there, like, the other thing is I always ask students, who is this written for? Mm-hmm. Who is the projected audience for this story? And when it's Du Bois, you always have to think like, well, he's writing this for white people. He's writing this for white people. He is expecting to have a white audience. Yes. And so the transgressive nature of the story is obvious, Black guy, white woman. But the transgressive nature of the story goes deeper than just simple miscegenation. It goes to the core of the nature of the political project. It was very central to him at the time he was writing. Then when you get to the Dark Princess, like Phil says, like that project has run into some problems. Mm-hmm. Like it doesn't take long. Like it's a very different tone. In some ways, that further down the line he's going to give up and leave. but the sort of ideological project that, his view of Black citizenship is, he still, I often think when you read the comment that he still believes that if you can just like get people's mind right, white people's mind right,
He still has faith in people.
yeah, it can change. But when you start getting to the Dark Princess, I'm like, there's a structural question here that he's dealing with, and like, that's not a simple exercise around changing people's mind, right? It's more complicated in Dark Princess.
It was wild though, if you think about it, it took him 8 years between that, right? So on the one hand, there's a thread of pessimism in the comment, but by 8 years later, the Dark Princess, he's like, look, it's all about Black self-determination at this point, right? We need to unify. So you have to think about what happens within those 8 years between that. One, him developing further as a scholar, right? On the thresholds of the Great Depression, because what the Dark Princess is 1928, it's looking pretty grim for Black folk right there, right? So, I just think what the difference 8 years can make.
All right, so now this segues excellently into one of the questions that I had, and I think this is quite appropriate because I think we're rounding up the time of this conversation. I wish we had scheduled this for 2 hours, but of course, I can talk about this kind of stuff all night. Maybe we should like get together, and fly somewhere, right? But at any rate, W.B. Du Bois was one of the most brilliant minds that America has had, not just Black minds, but he was one of the most brilliant minds that we've had in this country, in our history. If he lost hope, what do you all think of the current situation today with the Black Lives Matter protests going on all over the world? And we're now entering a sort of new moment. And I do believe that's the new moment we're entering into. Because Blacks have been protesting for a long time, never stopped protesting ever since the first ship got over here, even before that. So what is making people pay attention to it now worldwide is another historical moment. What does that mean then for some of the brightest Black minds who can speculate what a future looks like without racism, without this idea of white racial supremacy? If that brilliant mind of Du Bois could lose faith, what hope do we have today? And I want to kind of throw that out to both of you. And Julian, I'll ask you to take this one first. I know that's a mouthful, so I'll give you a minute to think.
I think that one thing to keep in mind is that the nature of speculative work is both rooted in the moment that is being created, but it's also unbound by that, right? So, the historical work that we looked at, some of those futures are but they're also rooted in a kind of a set of possibilities that the person can envision, right? Like even if they're incredibly transgressive. And so the growth of human thought does help, I think, in terms of like speculative practice, right? So contemporary people who are involved in speculative practice have more tools in their hands to think about a kind of future world. And the themes are the same, an end of oppression, but the means can be very different, both in terms of like the nature of like, I think one of the things that makes this particular moment particularly meaningful is because like, oh, by the way, white people have figured out that the system ain't right either, right? A pandemic is like a great equalizer. Oh, the system this isn't right. I've heard Black people talking about the system not being right for a long time. Maybe they have a point. What was it that you were saying again, my friend? That kind of thing, right? Like, it's because you're actually being screwed over by the system that you're actually listening to Black people. Like, honestly, I think that's a part of it. But there's also like a global set of circumstances that are endangering people in a global way, right? Like we talk about and envision dystopian futures around environment, but we have, you know, super fires now because of global warming. I mean, like, and that's not me making up that term. A scientist on NPR literally referred to like the forest fire in California. Yeah, we have super fires now because of systemic changes. The nature of pandemics is also a consequence of these systemic changes. The sense that the system has run its course and that course has been a failure is not just simply a black person's critique. It's an experience that every person is having. So black people's practice of visioning of a more equitable future becomes not just simply some sort of political statement. It becomes a roadmap for like survival, right? That's part of the reason why people are so enamored with Afrofuturism. Like these people have been thinking about like making the world a better place and succeeding. They've been succeeding. If you think about the nature of freedom and the American experience, just think about what it would be if black people weren't here. Think how bad it would be if black people were. I mean, yes, black people have crossed some burning sands, but that crossing has literally made every American better. There is no denying that. Black people have literally suffered, and that suffering has made the substance of the American experience better. And so we can argue about, you know, at some point you get to stop giving, but it's about the same thing. Like black people are envisioning a future, and right now, given the systemic failure that people are looking at, they're like, tell me more about this thing that you're talking about. And that actually, I think, makes a sort of kind of sense.
I'll just, add on to that. When we think about critical race theory, for example, the practice, storytelling has always been a part of, dismantling, racial hierarchies in many regards. And I think we're just going to, if you think about all the texts now that are in existence that we could classify under the broad umbrella of Afrofuturism, right? Whether it be, actual literary text, or whether it be movies or films or comic books or music or whatever the case may be, we have an unbridled amount of them now, right? And I think one of the great things about what we're seeing now is, just how apt some of these folks are to sort of just, buck the tradition, right? And, self-publish or self-produce or so on and so forth, right? They're sort of breaking away from those institutional gatekeepers that largely kept those stories from being told in the past. Now, what does that, as to the other aspect of your question, right? Which is, well, if the greatest thinker in, the 20th century about race, gives up on the American project. Look, I'm not going to lie to you right now. Your boy B. Cunningham is looking at jobs in Canada because his situation is looking mighty grim. But what I would say is, I think, Julian really hit the nail on the head. I mean, I don't necessarily think that our conditions are fully the same, but I also don't think that our reactions are much different, right? People have the purpose of this, exhibit has been, people have been thinking about what the future can look like for a long time. And in doing so, they present us with visions of despair occasionally, right? But also of hope. And I think, that's essentially what we're seeing play out before us today as well.
Right, and I'm so glad that you ended on that note of hope. And at this point, I think I'm going to segue into the question and answer. And I know this is sort of not what we discussed in our run through, but Clarissa, can we give her the screen or the voice to sort of field some of the questions? Because I have no idea what's been coming in, but you have, and if you guys can give her the voice, if she doesn't mind, if she can sort of ask some of the questions that's been coming in from the people who have attended this. Is there any way we can do that?
I'll start with the first question, and it's from Stephanie Moody, and she asks about historical fiction. Can that fit into the category of Afrofuturism? And her example was Coates, the Water Dancer.
Yeah, I think that every generation has a future, right? So, the setting of the story doesn't necessarily preclude it being, a historical story that doesn't mean it can't be Afrofuturist, right? Because the practice of Afrofuturism is built on a set of um, projects around liberation, around equity, around decentering whiteness, and so on and so forth. So it can be a historical fiction story and be Afrofuturist, in my opinion.
Right. I mean, think about it, the very first. If we want to credit it as the first, right? Delaney's Blake is set within the moment, right? It's a slave revolt, written in 1859, I believe.
Right.
Somewhere there. So it's very contemporary for that time. So yeah, I absolutely agree. It doesn't have to be necessarily futuristic, right? But it has to speculate about sort of the possibilities of what the future can bring.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Could you please restate the title of the exhibition, and will it be virtual?
The exhibition is called A Past Unremembered, The Transformative Legacy of the Black Imaginary. It's not virtual right now, but I am working on creating a virtual version. But, it's got to sort of like run its course physically. But when I finally get that done, I will let you know.
Okay. Can you please repeat the name of the novel that was mentioned about white Americans trying to re-invade Africa with disastrous results?
Oh, that is The White Man's Burden, a satirical forecast. The White Man's Burden, a satirical forecast. That's Roger Sherman Tracy, and I believe it's written in 1915. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
You can get that I'm not sure. Is that in Project Gutenberg?
Yeah, I was going to say, I would guess it might be on Project Gutenberg.
Project Gutenberg is a place where things that are in the public domain, literary works that are in the public domain, can be read for free. So The Comet is in Project Gutenberg. And since most of these works are before 1924, most of them probably are in Project
in the public domain. Absolutely.
Yeah. In this world that's full of colors, will we ever see things act beyond black and white? As a diverse global African people, the so-called whites are a diverse group of European people, as well as are the Asians, Native, Indigenous people. And we have been seeking freedom ever since the original captivity, set the captives free. Some of our enslaved ancestors were freer than many of us here, and now we need to be who we are before captivity. So the question out of this is, will we ever think beyond black and white?
I think one of the things if we want to think hopefully, right? I think one of the things I always talk to my students about when we talk about race is the fact that, if you read sort of Neale and Painter's The History of White People, right? At one point in this country, in the late 18th century, right, you had a myriad of classifications of race, right? Right now we've come to think of race as somewhat of a social construct, right? We've largely come to agree that race isn't real, right? But it's real in the sense that we've endowed it with realness. But we've largely come to understand that, race has no real basis in biology, for example, right? And that has taken us 100 years or so to get to, right? So I remain hopeful that in the next 100 years we'll finally dispense some of that. And I think the authors that we looked at, and if you look at even some of the work of contemporary authors, they're doing the work to sort of dismantle this to the best of their ability. And then again, I'll be frank, some of them are looking to reaffirm those things, right? I mean, because again, whether we like it or not, race has become real. Although I think, again, most of us are beginning to reach a place where we recognize that it is more a social construct in its realness and not anything based in science.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that the idea of race and and I like Phil. I've had students read the history of white people, and I used to teach a class about race in the United States, and it was about whiteness, because like that's the most made up of all things, right? Because like if you go back in time, almost no one who walks around in the United States right now would be qualified as white. Like almost none, unless they were from a very particular part of like the British Isles, they are not white. And it wasn't very long ago that Italians weren't even considered white. I mean, that was really like a 1960s, late 50s, 60s transformation. And so the politics around whiteness are dependent upon othering. They're dependent upon like talking about other people who are not white, right? Like that's how people who used to not be white got to be white. They differentiate themselves against black people. Like, I'm not like this, right? And there are court cases in the early 20th century where like certain ethnic groups, Chinese,
Indian,
Japanese, Indians, go to court to prove they are not black, because legally, if you're not white, well, they're like, no, I'm not black. I'm not black. So there's a fluidity there around the codification around whiteness, and the codification around not being white. But it's basically the codification around not being white that is completely constructed. Like it's completely constructed, and you can go back. Like one of my great sort of like jokes with students was like, "Tell me where your ancestors came from." They say, "I'm like, you're not white." Tell me, not white, right? Like, and they were like, I did this as a predominantly white institution, so I probably shouldn't have done it, but it was the truth. And so, the constructed nature of this and the classifications around race, even in the 20th century, you could cross a state line in the South and go from being black to white. Like even in the 20th century, like 1940s, 1950s, like because the way the laws were written were very particular. So like if you counted like 1/8 of your ancestor might have been black. And then, I was born in Alabama. Pretty much every white person in Alabama is a little black, and they don't want to admit it, right? Like they're pretty much all black, based on the one drop rule, right? They don't look it, but like the nature of the beast is that is the case. So if that complexity in terms of construction, which we took hundreds of years to create, it's going to take us a little while to move past it, right? So I'm with Phil on this. We've pretty much established that biological thing ain't true. And again, I always point out to students, if black people and white people were different species, they wouldn't be able to have babies together, right? Like that's how biology actually works. Right? Like, you don't get to say like they're a different race. Like that's not how science works. Like if they can have kids together, then they're the same thing. So it's all made up. So eventually it'll stop. It's gonna take some work, but it will stop.
First, let me apologize. It's Mr. Fields, and his question is: was Marcus Garvey an Afrofuturist?
I would say so. Listen, my man was predicting, or at least putting into action, right, the notion of a black empire, right? He's strutting down the streets of New York in regalia. He has a Black Star line that he's trying to get going. To a degree, he did so legally or practically, is up for debate. But I mean, he's definitely thinking, of Black empire, right? Or thinking of a nation, reaching that sort of self-determination that, Du Bois was even thinking about in some of his work, right? The Dark Princes, right? That self-determination Garvey is trying to put into action. And, we have some modern parallels, right? We hear that in the words of someone like Umar Johnson, for example, that thread of, hey, listen, there's this Black future, or there's this Black world we can create on our own. And there's a degree of agency in that. So I would definitely consider Marcus Garvey a Black.
So
let me ask you, in the exhibit, I saw a panel of John Edward Bruce. Would you associate him with the Marcus Garvey, Black nationalist kind of ideas with what he was doing in his works?
So Bruce works alongside Garvey for a short period of time, and then he sort of change. If memory serves me correctly, he sort of changes his mind. But the piece that we look at, is The Black Sleuth, which is sort of one of the sort of first Black detective novels. It's certainly not the first, but one of the very first in the genre. But what he's doing is sort of taking us out of the notion of the sort of Black-white binary in an American context and thinking about, Africa in particular, right? It's a very Afrocentric novel in the sense that the protagonist is not Black, he's African, right? I'm using Black here to represent sort of African-American, right? Because in this case, but I mean, he was a contemporary for a while of Garvey, and then I guess, things sort of fell apart as they are apt to do, unfortunately, with Garvey.
Yeah, I mean, I think the transgressive nature of Garvey's speculative practice, right, is very public. It's dressing up, it's marching down the street, it's
performative, right?
It's super performative, and it's also structurally quite aggressive, right? Like in the sense of empowering Black people, but also very much in the sense of like undercutting the mythologies that white people have, like reaching out to the KKK and having sort of like, these faux conferences that in a way calls attention, and I don't think it was intended to be satirical, but it is kind of satirical. A Black nationalist and a white nationalist talking about dividing up the world, that calls attention to the frailty of the mythologies that civilization offers up, right? And you can see that play itself out, quite easy in a lot of Black speculative work. Like when, it's not just simply about the race, it's also about power and exploitation. And that work often calls attention to that, right? Like the power is important to understand. So yeah, I would put him in there. But it'd be interesting to think about him as a figure, again, a Black nationalist ideology for a lot of people, African Americans, has to sound a certain way. But in fact, there is a strand of Black nationalism across all these works. It's just expressed in slightly different ways, right? And so, again, it reminds me, Du Bois is a key figure because, like, if we weren't talking about simply speculative work, like fictive work, then I would, retool this and go, let's talk about speculative practice, and then you would put W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, and they are doing the same thing, right? And the way we write the history book, you're like, no, they're diametrically opposed. I'm like, no, they are employing a kind of speculative framework to project Black people to the future. They're just different ideologically. They're slightly different ideologically.
Right? Booker T. Washington, even though he was publicly against political protests, funded a lot of political protests.
Right, yeah, more sneaky.
Right.
Way more sneaky. Of course, he had to be more sneaky because he was in Alabama.
Right.
Right, like, if you're in Alabama and you want to foment protests in the early 20th century, you need to be sneaky.
Exactly.
Right, like you're in Boston talking about it's relatively simple, right? Like, like it's not like a revelation here, right? Like,
right. But the public persona, most people don't know that because of what they're given, in our sort of standard history books. And really where there is seemingly a fight, or the same thing with Richard Wright and Zora Neale Hurston, where people think that there is a fight. There really is not a fight. It's just people looking at the same problem from two different perspectives. So at any rate, I think that we are probably beyond our time, so we probably should cut off the questions. At this point, I want you all to thank our panelists for I don't think I'm going to sleep for a little while tonight because I'm just going to start looking up stuff that these two men have talked about. I love these kind of conversations. I hope that this engendered some kind of quest in everyone to go and learn more about this stuff. And thank you so much. And thank you for Full Sail. Thank you for Zora Neale Hurston Festival for putting this on. And, you know, we appreciate you all. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Come into the world. Don't be afraid of the wicked.